Hey, welcome back to Change the Odds, the podcast where marriage and family were never meant to be a game of chance. Well, once again, we're in the summertime, July, so it's just me and you. Blaine and Adrian are still in Canada, where it's probably cooler than what it is right here. Hey, don't forget to go like and subscribe, Apple, Spotify, YouTube channel. You can watch it there. Hey, we are less than a month away now from the release of my next book, The Creation of Us. I don't even have a copy yet. I want one. But I don't have one. But on today's episode, I'm just going to kind of give you the background of where the book came from, what it's about. But before I do, I'd love it if you could go to Amazon and pre-order the book. Hey, here's what we're going to do. For everybody who pre-orders the book before it launches on August 4th, you're going to, if you order it, you can go then on changetheodds.com, enter into a very simple type form, your name, your phone number, and where you ordered it from. And then on August 4th, 5th, or 6th, I'm going to go down that list, and we're going to randomly select one person that's pre-ordered that book. At that moment, I'm going to call you, or I'm going to text you. And whenever I call or text you, you will then have 1 hour to send me a picture of your physical copy. And if you can do that, then here's what we're going to do. We have a retreat coming up in the fall in Napa, and we're going to give you 3 days, 2 nights at an extremely nice hotel there in Napa, and then all the content that comes with the marriage retreat that we're going to be doing there. So all of that will be free for somebody who pre-orders, but you have to order before the book launches on August 4th. You can go to Amazon, Books A Million, wherever books are sold online. You can go and pre-order, and then make sure you enter your name. You can, if you want to, you can link it at the bottom of this episode wherever you're watching, and we can send you the link to make sure that you get that there. But The Creation of Us is coming August 4th, so make sure you go and pre-order. But let's kind of talk about what the book is about and where it comes from. So 10 years ago now, I wrote Friends, Partners, and Lovers. I think it came out 9 years ago, but I wrote Friends, Partners, and Lovers 10 years ago. So that book is what it takes to make a marriage work. So the idea is take a 3-legged stool like this mic stand that I have here. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see this microphone stand has 3 legs. And whenever I was looking at what's my job description as a husband? What is it that Jenny actually needs from me? In looking at Genesis 2, I thought it is this idea of God said, I'm going to make a helper fit for him. Helper meaning there's a task. So is this idea of partnership. Fit, what's unique about Eve as opposed to all the other animals? It is this equality, this friendship that's there. And then Genesis 2:25 ends with they were naked and they were not ashamed, that God created this very unique quality to the marriage relationship called intimacy. So I just took Genesis 2 and said, all right, friend, partner, and lover, that's what Jenny needs from me. And so that's really what it takes to make a marriage work. If we each play these 3 roles, this is how marriage can be successful. And if any one of those legs is weak, it's the equivalent of if this mic stand, if one of the legs was shorter than the other 2, it would become unbalanced. It'd be more easily tipped over. And yet when all 3 are strong, there's a stability, there's a resilience that is actually there. And so 10 years have passed since I wrote that book, and I still travel and talk about it, and chances are I'm going to do that for the rest of my life because I honestly believe in that material so well. But where The Creation of Us comes in is it's almost going to give us the background and the detail of what prevents us from being friends, partners, and lovers, and then what can empower us to actually become those things. And so there's going to be a chapter, for instance, on attachment. Well, if you can't actually attach with one another, then you're always going to have a friendship that has some distance to it. You're not going to function well in partnership, and your intimacy is going to be frayed. So that is a kind of very foundational kind of topic of how to become those things. There's a chapter on attention. That's a very practical concept, that if you don't give intentional attention, which you've heard me talk about on this podcast so often, to your spouse, then before long, you're not going to feel like friends. You won't know what they need from a partnership standpoint. So much of intimacy is, how does Sue Johnson talk about intimacy? Doesn't she say, into me you see? That's what intimacy is, that I see into the other person. Well, if I'm not paying attention to them, then it's going to kill that lover element, which eventually will kill the friendship and the partnership. So the creation of us really becomes a how-to. If you're struggling to be friends, partners, and lovers. So friend, partners, and lovers tells us what we need to be. The creation of us really tells us how we can do that in the best way and the healthiest way. The very foundational idea of this book comes probably 10 or 15 years ago. So back in Arkansas at the church that I was at, my father in the ministry, the man who's meant so much to me, and one of the reasons I'm in the ministry, his wife was a counselor, is a counselor, and many times we would talk and bounce ideas off of each other. I probably don't write on marriage if it wasn't for her and her teaching me and training me. She was Gottman trained, and so a lot of Gottman influence that was there. And so I just want to help other people experience healthy marriages. I know what it's like to come from parents who go through divorce, and I don't want them to have to experience that. I don't want anybody else to experience it. So I'm very intrigued by the topic, and so she and I would just talk. And one of her general principles always was that people struggle to see their marriage as its own entity. And I've kind of picked up this theme. And so often whenever you ask somebody, man, how is life? They might tell you how they feel or what they're experiencing. You ask them, how's business? And they can say, well, then these numbers are up and these numbers are down and sales are this and the stock price is that. You ask them, how's your family? And they'll quickly say, oh, well, Ella's doing this and Silas is doing that. Well, how's your marriage? But whenever you ask, how's your marriage, they can't respond. If I were to ask you, how's your golf game? You were to ask me, how's your golf game? I could go into excruciating details of, man, I'm driving the ball great. I'm not hitting my irons as well as I normally can. I'm chipping poorly here recently, and I'm putting well in these areas. But if I were to ask you, how's your tennis game? You might be able to say, man, here's my strong volley, and my forehand's really strong. But man, serving to the backhand, I'm weak at. You would know all these details. Whenever I ask somebody, how's your marriage, so often they just kind of give it a blank stare, and they just kind of go, I don't know, it's okay. And they don't see it as its own thing that's out there. And so the creation of us kind of begins with this idea that marriage is its own entity. It's a thing that includes me, but it's also beyond me. And there's part of me that also stands outside, distinct from marriage. Marriage doesn't actually define the totality of who I am. The way God has created marriage, I'm not going to forever be married to Jenny. One day death will separate us. I think John Piper calls it this temporary marriage. He doesn't mean that you should get divorced and move on earth. He's not saying that. But what he's showing is that in eternity, Jesus says we won't be married. And yet he's brought us together in these moments. And there is this distinct union that is there, that the connection between me and Jenny is different than me, Jenny, Ellen, Silas. It's distinct from that. And so to begin to think about your marriage in those terms, that it has its own standard of quality of life. It has its own unique ups and downs. And so the creation of us is built on a general concept of like an equilateral triangle. And so if you take a triangle, and at the base of the triangle, for me, on one angle, I would say Kevin, and on the other angle, I would say Jenny. Other ways you can say that just him and her. So the base of the triangle are these two unique individuals. They're not the same thing, not just a dot. They're these two individuals that are separated by time and space and different skills and abilities and experiences, who then have chosen to come together. And at the top of that triangle, the apex of the triangle, that angle I call the us angle. And that is now the shared union. And whenever we think about what a healthy marriage looks like, a healthy marriage is the flourishing of all three of those angles. Him, her, and us. Now, it doesn't mean that all three flourish at the exact same speed or rate. There are times in which maybe I'm struggling and Jenny isn't. And our marriage might be doing well, but maybe in my own personal life, maybe professionally or emotionally or mentally or physically, I might be struggling. And so it doesn't mean that all three have to at all moments be at a 10 or you're a failure. It's not that. But it is this recognition that all three matter and all three are different. That Jenny and I are two distinct individuals. And even though we come together in marriage and the two become one, and we truly do become one, that doesn't mean that we become one at the exclusion of the two or the detriment of the two. One of the reasons I love the image of the triangle is it's a theological image. Whenever I was in seminary, our New Testament professor used to always tell us, hey, anytime you see any aspect of the Trinity, the Father, Son, or the Holy Spirit, anytime you see one of them mentioned in the Bible, just draw a triangle, and it'll show you God's presence. If you remember, if you go by the little devotional book that I have, Hope Scrolling, I say in the opening of Hope Scrolling, read the passage of the day, and every time you see Father, Son, or Spirit, God mentioned, just draw a triangle. And what you'll begin to see is how many triangles jump off the page. Because if we're not very careful, whenever you and I read the Bible, we tend to make it about ourselves. And we make us the primary character instead of God himself. And by doing that exercise, it reminds you, hey, God's very present here. But think about the Trinity, the triangle. The Trinity is God in three persons, yet being one. It's a mystery. It's difficult for us to understand. No doubt it may be the hardest aspect of the Christian faith to understand, and yet it's extremely biblical that God is three distinct persons and yet also one at the same time. I think that gives us a beautiful picture of what a healthy marriage looks like. That even as Jenny and I are uniquely one, that we are bound together in this unique relationship, the apex of that triangle, that does not mean that I no longer exist or that Jenny no longer exists. Instead, we are fully relevant and existing. As a matter of fact, I would go on to say that if the marriage is healthy, it draws more of me out. I become more of who God created me to be. That hopefully my love for Jenny can call out of her more of God's calling upon her life, more of who God has made her to be, can call out of her, hopefully in a loving, kind, and compassionate way, ways in which she's not aligning with her true nature now in Jesus, and she can repent and change those ways, and I can do the exact same thing. And so a healthy marriage now, instead of killing us, should actually bring out the fullness of who God has actually created us to be. But at the same time, even as we're both hopefully individual flourishing, there's also this other entity beyond just me, beyond just her, one that we're actually going to place above our own selves, recognizing that as we submit ourselves to each other and to it, that we actually find more life, both individually and together. And so our marriage is this kind of own unique thing. And so the creation of us really is about all three. It's about him, her, and us. And how can we see the flourishing of each of those angles? And in my opinion, where so many Christian marriage books get it wrong is they just talk about the us. And they kind of live in denial of the individual. And I get it. You hear the idea the two should become one flesh. And you hear the idea about dying to self. And it's pretty easy to allow that to be skewed into this idea of, I just need to not exist anymore. But that's not how a marriage is made up. And at the same time, I think apart from the church, where the great struggle is, we talk about this in premarital all the time, outside the church, many people apart from God never even fathom the idea of submitting to somebody else or creating this unique entity. And so outside the church, the struggle is almost living these parallel lives where I expect you to come and fit into my life perfectly, but I'm going to continue to be me no matter what. And the idea of submitting to somebody else or finding my happiness now in the submission to another or a higher kind of thing is anathema to me. And so outside the church, we tend not to create an us. Inside the church, we tend to focus on the us at the exclusion of the individuals. And I think the biblical example is neither of those. Instead, it's the flourishing of all three. And so it's not uncommon. Just a month from now, if you're listening this as it releases in early July of 2026, as school gets back into session in August, it's not unusual for somebody to send their youngest off to college and within a day or two to come into my office and say, Kevin, I've raised my kids and now they're moved out and they're gone and I don't even know who I am anymore. And while that's a natural transition in life, it's also a failure in marriage. That if we can lose our identity, then the marriage hasn't been operating the way it should. Now, I'm not saying there's a villain there. I'm not trying to shame or blame anybody, but it's a challenge, hopefully, to all of us that at all times we need to have this regular kind of observation and review of all three elements in a healthy marriage. Now I want to stop here and just notice one thing. Some people will critique this because as soon as they hear the triangle, if I'm out doing a marriage conference, they hear the triangle and I say put him on one angle, her on the other. They always write God at the top. And then whenever I say put us at the top, they're like, well, I don't understand. I thought God was at the top. The closer we draw to God, the closer we draw to each other. Whatever. It's an old illustration. You can take it or leave it. I prefer to leave it personally because in my opinion, God's in the midst of all of it. If you want to describe where God is in the midst of that triangle of the creation of us, hopefully he's in me, he's in Jenny, he's in the marriage and in the relationship, and he's also beyond us. He's outside of us as well. So God is an aspect of all these things. And I think we have to recognize that there are some ways in which I will independently stand before God and give an account for my own life. In some ways, the creation of us is kind of a practical outplaying of stay in your lane. You could rewrite stay in your lane to what's mine, what's ours, and what's God's. What are the things that I'm uniquely responsible for? And I can't blame Jenny for those things. I can't put those expectations upon her. There are some things I'm supposed to bring to the table, and I need to be those things and recognize it's my job as an individual to be that. At the same time, it's Jenny's job to do the exact same thing, to be who God has created her to be, and to bring that to the table. And then together, God meshes all that up together, and then we become this unique entity that is us. And yet so often in marriage, if we're not very careful, the very thing that we're supposed to bring to the table, we can often expect our spouse to bring to us. Think about happiness. Is happiness something you get from marriage or something you bring to marriage? Well, hopefully it's both. But first and foremost, it's something you bring to marriage. You bring a sense of contentment, of joy, of happiness to the table. And then Jenny is charged with bringing her own sense of happiness, joy, and contentment to the table. And then as we combine those two things, as hopefully we're both now bringing the fullness of ourselves to that, then it becomes a reciprocal kind of relationship where then what I'm bringing to the table of marriage, I'm also hopefully receiving as well. That becomes a very positive thing. But for so many people, they expect their marriage to make them happy. And whenever they come to the table, they're not happy to begin with. They expect to get that from their spouse or from marriage itself. And when their spouse doesn't produce that, they see that as their spouse's problem when it's really their own problem. They're expecting from their spouse something they're actually supposed to bring to the table themselves. The creation of us will help begin to dive into those kinds of things. And so the book really can be divided kind of into, so there's basically 3 or 4 kind of foundational chapters. So we'll open up with an idea of just the concept of the creation of us, all 3 of these things kind of flourishing. Even introducing a phrase you've probably heard me say here before, this idea of good dependence. So what we're looking for is, outside the church, people probably think that happiness is found in independence. If I'm not dependent upon somebody else, the thought is, I'll reach the full level of satisfaction and joy and happiness. And so apart from the church, the secular concept is that any outside expectations limit me. Any pressures put upon me by society, anywhere I have to submit to somebody else, that's going to limit my freedom and therefore limit my sense of happiness. And so secular society would say that true happiness is found in independence, and you being the fullness of who you get to be, make your own choices, your own decisions, submit to nobody, have everybody else fit into the world that you want. You make all the choices yourself, and that's going to lead to happiness. Well, it doesn't. Look at culture. Look at society. They're as unhappy as they have ever been. Independence does not produce what we actually want it to produce. Individual independence. It just doesn't work out. We're made for more than that. Well, inside the church, if we're not very careful, we can get into this idea and this concept of enmeshment, of a codependence. And so especially me as a lifelong people pleaser, if I'm not very careful, I can lose my own sense of identity and hand my emotional regulation off to other people. And so am I happy or sad? Well, it depends on how you are in this moment. You get to define who I actually am. And that becomes a very unhealthy relationship, even for people who love me. They don't deserve the pressure now of taking that on, of taking on my own emotions where they have to manage me. And so we want to steer clear of codependency. But instead, there is this idea of good dependency. It is both me being, a word you're going to hear in the coming weeks, differentiated, different, my own distinct individual, and yet also being attached to Jenny and also to others. To recognize I can't do life all by myself, and yet there are a lot of things that I can take care of and are my responsibility. And now Jenny and I have chosen to submit to each other, to become dependent upon each other, but in a healthy, hopefully reciprocal kind of way. And a good dependence means I can emotionally regulate myself, but I can also at times humble myself and submit to her and ask her to assist me. One of the challenges I often give to men is, in a non-sexual way, can you ask your wife to hold you? That just after a long day, a stressful day, a day maybe you're full of insecurities or uncertainties, just have her embrace you and feel the warmth of her body and the hug that is there and the soothing and the calming that can come as your body releases oxytocin and dopamine and the serotonin, the hormones that are actually there, and as she does the same, to know that you're not at this alone. One of the things I talk about whenever I talk about friends, partners, and lovers is, so friendship, somebody's by your side; partnership, somebody always has your back; and intimacy, somebody sees you and loves you completely. Is that in a great marriage, isn't it great to know that you're never alone? That you always have somebody who's by your side. You always have somebody who has your back. You always have somebody who sees you and loves you. A good dependence is now me learning how not to unfairly burden Jenny, but to leverage her in a healthy, honoring way, in a way that helps me, and in a way that I can help her. That life is too hard to go about it on our own. I mean, what did Scripture begins with? It's not good for man to be alone. We don't do well by ourselves. Now, that's a verse that's bigger than just marriage. It means community, but it's also a verse about marriage, that we're better together. And now good dependency means we learn what it means to lean upon each other in a healthy way, in a reciprocal way, and not being too independent to where we're trying to do this on our own, and yet not becoming too enmeshed to where we lose our own sense of self or put too much pressure on somebody else. But instead we live in a healthy kind of dependency. So the book opens with that concept, and then chapter 2 defines what does health even look like, and we take kind of Dan Siegel's definition of what a healthy brain looks like, and then we apply that to marriage. So Siegel talks about that a healthy brain now is created by two hemispheres. You have your right hemisphere and your left hemisphere. And they are distinct, they are differentiated, they're different from each other, and they're tasked with different things. And so the left hemisphere thinks in a much more linear kind of way, logical. All your language comes from your left hemisphere. Your right hemisphere is more artistic. It carries your autobiographical information. And so both sides of the brain now function in different ways, but even as they do that, they then link together. They communicate, and that communication now leverages the strengths of both sides and creates something bigger. The whole is bigger than the individual parts. And so for Dan Siegel, a healthy brain is differentiation plus linkage. It is being distinct while then working together. And so he's going to say a healthy brain now, mental health, is when both hemispheres are differentiated and yet linked together. He is going to say all mental disorder, all mental disease, all mental illness is some breakdown where either one of the hemispheres isn't functioning as it should, or they're competing against each other, or they're operating as they should, but they're not communicating properly. And he can show how every mental illness will fall into one of those categories where the brain is not functioning in a healthy way. I think that's the perfect illustration of what a healthy marriage looks like, where we are differentiated. Jenny and I are different people, different skills, different abilities, different expectations, but then we are linked together, linked in purpose, in mission, in value, in work ethic, in effort. So we're different, and then we're linked. And every time that we operate in an unhealthy way, it either means one of us isn't doing what we were created to do, or we're not communicating well with each other. We're fighting against each other instead of working collaboratively together. And so I think it's a beautiful picture of what a healthy marriage actually looks like, is this idea of differentiation and then linkage. And in the health of us, we talk about what that means. And then we spend a whole chapter talking about the barriers of us. So what is it that prevents us from being the fullness of who God has created us to be? And we get into some of the cultural expectations of how we're looking at marriage wrong, especially in this extreme individualistic kind of society. It can prevent us from wanting to be in a good dependent relationship with somebody else, of submitting to somebody else, of having the vulnerability of revealing ourselves, because if we're not careful, we do that to the wrong people, we can be taken advantage of and it not work very well. So we talk about a variety of different barriers. Our own personality can be a barrier, us not understanding what the other person is. You've heard me say this oftentimes here with Blaine and Adrian so many times. The differences that God has placed in our spouse that frustrate us were actually placed there to protect us. And yet if we don't recognize those differences, we can actually fight against the very thing that we should be leveraging for our own benefit. And so we talk about the barriers of us. And then there's one chapter that I think kind of teeters between the foundational issues and then the much more the 8 other very practical issues, and that is the issue of attachment, which if you've listened to this podcast at all, you've heard me go on about ad nauseum, no doubt. Love Styles, my previous book, goes into this in a much more detailed way than I can in this single chapter of probably 4,000 words here in this chapter. But it's such an important chapter. I still think it's extremely foundational of the creation of us now is somewhat dependent upon you and I recognizing what our love style is and then learning secure attachment. And as we learn secure attachment, then we can begin to operate in a healthy way of him, her, and us. But non-secure attachment will then skew the picture of all 3 of those angles. Whenever we live in non-secure attachment, we will not properly place and value myself, my spouse, and the relationship that we have together. Avoidantly attached will put too much emphasis now on the distinction and wanting to stay separate. Anxious attachment will fall too much into a codependency and an enmeshment, and we'll focus on the us at the exclusion of the individuals. And disorganized will do a combination of both of those. It's only secure attachment that actually allows for the flourishing now of us, him, and her, of all 3 of those angles. And so we have these opening, let's say, 4, notice how I've made up my mind just as I'm shooting this podcast, talking to you, that I'm going to put attachment now as these foundational. So we have these 4 foundational chapters, And then we're going to have 8 topical issues that are many of the traditional concepts of what you think of whenever it comes to marriage books. A couple of them you probably have never heard before, but many of them that you have, of what's preventing us from truly creating us. And so we'll talk about money, communication, intimacy, talk about faith, but there's also some things that maybe we haven't thought about before. The idea of health, the healing of us, that the marriage relationship is designed, I think, in part by God